Evelyn Carter had imagined many difficult moments on her journey west, the rickety stagecoach rides, the dust storms, the unpredictable manners of men who lived on the edge of civilization. But she had never once imagined that humiliation could arrive in the form of a wooden floorboard giving way beneath her feet. The trading post bathhouse was small, nothing like the grand tiled rooms she'd known back east. Here, steam curled around gaps in the rough planked walls, and the wood smelled of pine and mineral water. Evelyn had paid a full silver dollar for the luxury of washing trail dust from her skin. She'd shed her boots, rolled up her sleeves, and tested the first step toward the tub when the plank beneath her gave a soft, traitorous crack. She gasped, arms flailing, and before she could catch herself, the world tilted sharply. Her feet shot out from under her. She plunged through a narrow break in the bathhouse wall straight into scalding heat, splashing water, and a deep, startled voice. A strong hand shot out faster than she could think. He caught her dot, not just her hand, her wrist, her arm, her waist. She collided with a broad chest, smooth with water and warm from the bath. Her breath jammed in her throat as she found herself half submerged in a tub occupied by a stranger. Not just a stranger, an Apache warrior. He looked at her with the calmest, most unreadable expression she had ever seen. Water dripped from his long black hair onto her shoulder. Muscles flexed beneath bronzed skin as he steadied her effortlessly, keeping her above the water with surprising gentleness. Evelyn froze, cheeks burning hotter than the steam dot of all the impossible, mortifying situations life could throw at a woman. I'm so terribly sorry, she sputtered, trying to free herself, but her limbs tangled awkwardly with his. The floor collapsed. I didn't mean to, His voice was soft, deep, low. You are not hurt? His question stunned her into silence. He was the one whose privacy she had crashed into literally, and yet his first concern was her safety. I think I'm fine, she managed, though her dignity was unquestionably drowned. She tried again to rise, but the tub was slippery, her dress soaked, and her boots, dear heavens, were floating beside her, seeing her struggle. The warrior shifted, planting one powerful arm against the edge of the bath. Do not rush, he said. You will fall again. His calmness both steadied her and flustered her more than any scolding would have. He lifted her, not roughly, not intimately, but with practiced strength. Water cascaded off her as he placed her on her feet just outside the tub. When he stepped out moments later, she realized just how incredibly tall he was, how effortlessly he carried himself, how silent and centered he seemed, even dripping wet. Without hesitation, he reached for a heavy woven blanket hanging by the wall and wrapped it around her shoulders. The brush of the fabric and the warmth beneath it grounded her racing heart. Your bath is ruined, he said simply. I will tell the owner to fix the floor. Evelyn's mortification surged. No, please, you shouldn't have to bother yourself. This was my fault entirely. For the first time, something like amusement flickered in his dark eyes. The floor broke. That is not your doing. He stepped back just enough to give her space, but his presence still filled the narrow room. She felt small beneath his gaze, not belittled, but noticed. Who are you? She asked quietly. Lone Hawk, he replied. Scout for the fort. And you? She swallowed. Evelyn Carter. He nodded once calmly. Then, Evelyn Carter, I am glad you did not drown in my bath. Heat flared in her cheeks again, and though she couldn't explain it, something in that absurd, intimate moment felt like the beginning of a story she had not meant to open, but could no longer close. Evelyn stood there wrapped in Lone Hawk's blanket, the thick wool clinging to her wet dress, steam curling around them like ghosts refusing to leave. Her heartbeat hadn't quite returned to normal, not after falling into the bath of a man whose presence filled the small room like a wall of heat. She kept her eyes trained firmly on the floorboards. It felt safer than looking at him again, safer than risking the memory of her hand slipping against his chest, or the way his fingers had circled her wrist with such controlled strength that she'd felt it all the way to her ribs. If you step outside, the wind is cold, he said quietly behind her. Wait a little. I will make fire. Make fire? Inside the bathhouse? But no, when she turned, he didn't mean fire in a hearth. He meant fire in himself. He knelt beside a small metal brazier in the corner and coaxed life from the remaining embers with practiced skill. Sparks glowed. Heat pulsed outward in waves. Evelyn was suddenly aware of the chill on her skin, the wet fabric clinging to her limbs, the way her teeth were starting to chatter. You need warmth, Lone Hawk said without looking at her. Sit. She hesitated out of propriety, or pride, or sheer confusion, but his tone was not a request. Not stern, either. Simply certain. As if he'd spent a lifetime reading storms and danger, and now read her the same way. She sat near the brazier, the blanket pooling around her feet. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft crackle of glowing coals. Lone Hawk didn't hurry. He moved with a calm that contrasted sharply with the frantic swirl of her thoughts. After a moment, he spoke again. You fell hard. You breathed too fast. Is your chest hurt? No, she whispered. Just embarrassed. He finally looked at her. Really looked not with mockery, not with the smug amusement she'd seen from men back east when a woman stumbled. He looked with a steady, thoughtful gaze, as though he were trying to understand the exact shape of her humiliation. You did nothing wrong, he said simply, but that didn't change how her pulse pounded. How the closeness of the room made her painfully aware of every detail, his still damp hair brushing over his shoulders, the fresh drops sliding down the hard lines of his collarbone, the slight shimmer of heat rising from his skin. She forced her gaze downward again. This must be a dreadful inconvenience to you, she murmured. If you'll just step outside, I can compose myself and— No. The single word was quiet but impossible to misinterpret. She blinked. No. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, unhurried. If I leave, you will faint. I will not, she protested. Though the spinning in her head suggested otherwise, he crossed the room, the soft thud of his bare feet on wooden planks sending a ridiculous jolt through her. Kneeling before her, he rested one warm, broad hand on her forearm. Not gripping, not restraining, simply anchoring. You tremble, he said. Heat rose in her cheeks again. I fell into a man's bath. What proper woman wouldn't tremble? He didn't smile. He didn't tease. Instead, he took the blanket edges and pulled them higher around her shoulders. You fear judgment, he said quietly. But there was no shame. You survived a fall. You respected privacy. Her breath caught. How absurdly kind he was. How composed. How can you be so calm about all of this? She asked. Lone Hawk considered her for a moment. Two people in water are nothing new. Water cleans. It does not shame. The simple wisdom struck her harder than any sermon she'd ever heard. Outside, the wind rattled the bathhouse walls. Inside, warmth grew between them, slow, heavy, undeniable. When she finally gathered the courage to stand, her legs wobbled. Lone Hawk rose instantly, steadying her by the waist. Before she could protest, their faces were suddenly close. Her breath mingled with his. He smelled of cedar smoke and warm water. She felt her heart tip dangerously. Careful. He murmured. Evelyn swallowed hard. I am trying. Their eyes met. Heat rippled. Unspoken things settled thick in the steam between them. And in that moment, tiny, fragile, electrifying, she realized she would never ever forget the feel of his hands on her dot by the time Evelyn stepped out of the bathhouse wrapped in Lone Hawk's blanket, hair damp, dignity hanging by a single shivering thread. She believed the worst was over. She was wrong. The moment her boots touched the packed dirt outside, 3 women gathering laundry froze mid-fold. A ranch hand leading mules stopped walking entirely. Even the blacksmith looked up from his glowing forge as if the hammer itself had paused mid-air. Whispers didn't begin. They exploded. Did she just? With him? In the bathhouse? Good Lord, she must be wild. She fell inshore. More like she went in. Color flooded Evelyn's cheeks so fast she nearly stumbled again. She clutched the blanket tighter, wishing the earth would conveniently open a second hole and swallow her whole. Lone Hawk stepped out behind her. That only made things worse. He was still damp. Hair dripping, chest half covered by a hastily thrown-on linen shirt left open at the collar. The sight of an Apache man emerging after her calm, unreadable, unruffled poured oil onto the burning curiosity of the crowd. A cluster of ranch wives covered their mouths. Pair of drunken cowboys snickered near the saloon steps. Looks like the little lady had herself a morning, one drawled. Evelyn's breath strangled in her throat. Lone Hawk moved before she could even breathe. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his knife. He didn't glare or posture or threaten. He simply stepped forward one smooth, quiet step and placed himself between Evelyn and the growing ring of staring faces. Air shifted instantly. He stood with the calm certainty of a man who didn't need to prove strength because he was strength. His silence alone made the cowboys' laughter die like a wind snuffed out. No more words, he said to them. Not loud, not angry, just. Final. One of the men opened his mouth to retort, but Lone Hawk's dark eyes held such steady warning that even the bravest thought. Twice. The ranch wives looked away, suddenly very interested in their baskets. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stood behind him, half concealed by his broad shoulders. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain. But what explanation existed that wouldn't sound absurd? I fell into the wall. The wood broke. I had no intention of landing in a warrior's lap. No one would believe it. Not when gossip tasted so much sweeter. Come, Lone Hawk said quietly to her. Without turning around, she obeyed, grateful for the shield his presence created. As they walked, people parted for them like a rippling tide. The whispers didn't stop. They simply shifted into low, poisonous murmurs that clung to the air behind them. Shameless. Eastern women are all the same. Throwing herself at him. He'll take advantage of that one. Every word pierced Evelyn's skin. Her throat tightened painfully. They think awful things about me. They speak because they have nothing to do with their tongues, Lone Hawk replied. You did nothing. Yet they think that we. She couldn't even finish the sentence. Lone Hawk finally stopped walking and faced her fully, and she realized again how calm he remained, how unaffected, as though the chaos swirling around them couldn't touch him. They saw what they wanted, not what was true, he said. The truth does not change. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unfairness of it all. I didn't ask for protection, she whispered bitterly. I know, he said. But you have it anyway, she blinked up at him. Why? Lone Hawk hesitated just for a breath before answering. In my people's ways, he said, if a woman suffers misfortune near a man, he must stand with her until she is safe. Evelyn's breath hitched. So you're helping me. Because of duty? His gaze softened, warm enough to melt the knot in her chest. No, he said. Because I choose. Before she could process that, a voice boomed from across the street. Miss Carter. The sheriff wants a word with you. The crowd's judgment had grown bolder. And now the law wanted a piece of her humiliation too. But Lone Hawk stepped slightly closer, so close she felt his warmth through the blanket. "Do not fear," he said quietly. "I stand with you." And for the first time since her disastrous fall, she believed him. The sheriff's carriage rattled to a stop outside the bathhouse. The townsfolk gathered at the edges of the street, their curious eyes like pinpricks of judgment piercing Evelyn from every angle. She felt exposed, humiliated, and acutely aware that every whisper, every smirk, every pointed finger was a thread tugging at her dignity. Lone Hawk stepped forward before she could even think of arguing. His posture was deliberate, calm, unshakable. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that silenced even the most insolent onlookers. "She is under my protection," he said. The words were simple, yet they struck through the murmurs like an arrow through smoke. The sheriff, a tall man with a square jaw, raised an eyebrow but did not challenge him. The townspeople muttered, some scoffing, others muttering to one another. But the power in Lone Hawk's tone made it clear. No one would cross him. And no one would touch Evelyn, not today, not here. Evelyn's mouth went dry. I don't need protection," she protested, her voice wavering. "I am perfectly capable of—" "You are capable," he interrupted softly. "But it is not a question of capability. It is a matter of honor." Honor. The word hung in the air heavier than any accusation the townsfolk had thrown at her. Lone Hawk explained, though gently, that in Apache tradition, if a woman comes to harm near a man, whether by accident or circumstance, it becomes the man's duty to ensure her safety. Evelyn blinked. Duty? Responsibility? The explanation sounded strange, almost foreign, yet in his calm certainty it seemed neither strange nor burdensome. His people had their own rules, rules shaped by survival and respect and principle she was only beginning to understand. "I do not require your protection," she said again, trying to reclaim some small piece of autonomy. Her voice carried more edge this time. A flicker of defiance mingled with her embarrassment. "You do not require it," Lone Hawk replied evenly. "But I offer it anyway, because it is my choice." The simplicity of that statement left her breathless. His choice, no one else's, not dictated by tradition alone, but by the strength of his own will. The thought was unsettling and intoxicating. The sheriff cleared his throat, glancing from Lone Hawk to Evelyn. "Well, if the lady insists," he muttered, though it was clear he had no intention of pressing the matter further. The townsfolk reluctantly dispersed, though whispers lingered like stubborn smoke in the corners of the street. Once the crowd thinned, Lone Hawk turned his attention back to her. His eyes were steady, dark, and unreadable. "The bathhouse floor must be repaired," he said, matter of fact. "The owner is responsible, but it is safer if you are not left here until it is fixed." Evelyn's heart sank. She hadn't wanted to be whisked away, to be considered fragile, to be treated like a treasure or a responsibility she hadn't asked for. And yet, in his unwavering presence, she felt the first flickers of relief. The tension of the town's judgment had eased, replaced by something else, the strange security of standing beside a man who would not let harm come to her. She tried to articulate the jumble of emotions that twisted inside her embarrassment, frustration, awe, and something unnameable. But words failed her. Instead, she nodded, letting him guide her away from the street. The weight of the damp blanket and his steady hand on her elbow grounded her in a way nothing else could dot as they moved toward the edge of town. Evelyn glanced back at the bathhouse, still steaming in the morning sun. Her cheeks flushed again, not from shame this time, but from the thought of the quiet strength of the man who had stood by her when the world had been ready to tear her down. It was a lesson she would not forget. Sometimes protection was not an insult to independence, but a measure of care. Sometimes, someone's choice to stand with you, even when you do not ask for it, could feel more empowering than any self-reliance she had ever known, and Evelyn began to realize that this strange, silent Apache warrior lone hawk was offering more than safety. He was offering a choice, the choice to trust him, to lean on him, even for a moment, without losing herself. And though she did not yet fully understand the weight of that gift, a small, stubborn part of her knew she wanted to accept it. The town had fallen behind them, the murmurs of judgment fading into the distance, replaced by the wide-open landscape of the frontier. Evelyn perched uneasily on the back of Lone Hawk's horse, her soaked dress clinging uncomfortably, her heart still pounding from the morning's chaos. He rode beside her with ease, alert and steady, the kind of presence that made her forget to think about the chill of the wind or the ache in her limbs. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft clop of hooves on dirt, the whisper of the wind through tall prairie grass, and the occasional distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Evelyn's mind was a storm of thoughts, her cheeks still flushed from embarrassment, and yet she felt a curious sense of calm. Lone Hawk didn't chatter. He didn't attempt to impress her with tales of bravery or frontier exploits. He simply rode, his eyes scanning the horizon, his posture unyielding yet graceful. Finally, unable to contain herself, she whispered, "Where are we going?" "To my camp," he replied, his voice low but steady. "It is safer there." She glanced at him, hesitating. "Safer? From them?" Her hand gestured vaguely toward the town they had left behind. He shook his head slightly. "Safer for you to be away from eyes that judge without understanding." The words, so simple yet so certain, struck something deep within her. For the first time that morning, Evelyn felt the raw relief of someone prioritizing her well-being, not because she demanded it, but because he chose to. The ride continued through rolling hills and patches of scrub brush, the distant mountains etched in shades of blue and gold under the morning sun. As the landscape opened into a wide valley, Lone Hawk slowed his horse and gestured toward a collection of simple but sturdy structures nestled among the trees. Smoke curled from small fires, the scent of wood smoke blending with the earthy aroma of the surrounding wilderness. "This is your people's camp?" Evelyn asked cautiously, curious to spite herself. Lone Hawk inclined his head. "Not all. Just those who travel with me. Scouts, trackers, and families of my clan. You will find safety here." When they approached, the camp welcomed them with a quiet, unassuming warmth. Children played nearby, laughter ringing in the air. Women were cooking over open fires, tending to daily tasks with calm efficiency. There was no rush, no hostility, no prying eyes ready to dissect her every move. She realized with a jolt that she had never experienced a space where she felt entirely seen without judgment, where her misstep in a bathhouse would not define her entire existence. Lone Hawk guided her to a small lodge with a partially covered porch. He gestured for her to step inside, offering her the warmth of a fresh blanket he had prepared. She accepted, her limbs finally relaxing as she let herself breathe. "You live like this?" she asked, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Yes," he said simply. "Life here is honest. Work, respect, survival. The town has rules, but the land has none but what we give it." Evelyn's eyes roamed the lodge, noting its simplicity, sturdy wood floors, furs neatly arranged, a small fire pit in the center, and tools carefully stored along the walls. It was unpretentious, yet everything spoke of thought, care, and purpose. She sank into the fur-lined chair he had offered, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and felt an unfamiliar sensation. She felt safe. Not just physically, though that was part of it. safe in a way that allowed her to exhale fully, to release the tension of townsfolk whispers, of social expectations, of fear of judgment. Lone Hawk stood across from her, quiet, observing. It was not silence that demanded attention, it was presence. He did not need to speak to assert power. It radiated from him, steady, unyielding. And Evelyn, exhausted by the morning's chaos, felt the weight of it, the grounding certainty that this man would not allow harm to come to her, not from anyone, not from anything. For the first time, she allowed herself to relax completely, to consider that this accidental plunge into a bathhouse had led her here, to a place far from the judgments of civilization, with a man whose presence was as dangerous as it was reassuring. She did not yet understand the full measure of this safety, nor the depth of the connection forming in silence. But she knew, unmistakably, that she wanted to remain here a while, if only to breathe, to observe, and perhaps to understand the strange pull of a man who had caught her, not just in the bath, but in a moment that had changed everything. Evelyn had spent the better part of the morning exploring the camp under Lone Hawk's quiet supervision. She observed the way the scouts moved, the way children laughed and played without fear, and the steady rhythm of life that seemed both harsh and comforting in equal measure. But it wasn't until the late afternoon, when the sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, that she noticed the scars. Lone Hawk was sitting beside the fire, cleaning his weapons with careful, deliberate motions. The muscles of his arms flexed under bronzed skin, each movement precise and efficient. Evelyn's gaze lingered, almost against her will, drawn by the subtle way his sinews worked, the taut lines of strength honed by years on the trail. Then she saw the scars. Faint at first, almost hidden by the sheen of sweat on his back, but unmistakable thin, jagged lines that told stories of violence, struggle, and survival. Some curved like shallow rivers across his shoulders, others were deeper. Reminders of battles fought and dangers faced. She felt a pang of something she couldn't name: admiration, awe, and a sharp twist of empathy. Every mark on his body spoke of a life that was not easy, a life in which every day demanded courage and skill. Lone Hawk glanced up from his work, catching her watching him. His dark eyes held hers for a moment, calm but perceptive. "You notice," he said simply, "no bitterness, no shame." "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to stare." "You may look," he said, his tone steady, almost gentle. "The body tells its own story. I do not hide it." Evelyn's heart skipped. There was something in his honesty, in the absence of pretense, that made her respect him even more. She realized that for all his physical strength, there was a vulnerability here, unspoken yet undeniable. He had faced battles she could scarcely imagine, and yet he had chosen to stand here, patient and protective, offering her safety after a fall that had been entirely her fault. I can't imagine what you've been through," she murmured. "It must have been difficult." Lone Hawk's eyes softened, though his expression remained composed. "It has been necessary," he said. "A warrior learns to endure. A scout learns to survive. Pain becomes a teacher." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. There was something humbling about the presence of a man who bore such marks without complaint, who moved through the world with quiet authority and an unshakable sense of self. For the first time, Evelyn felt a shift, not fear, not judgment, but a profound admiration that bordered on awe. The fire crackled between them, its warm glow reflecting off the planes of his face. She noticed the tension in his jaw, the way he seemed always ready to react, yet never reckless. It was a balance she could barely comprehend, strength paired with restraint, fierceness tempered by calm. "You are different from anyone I've met," she said softly, almost to herself. Lone Hawk's gaze met hers, steady and unblinking. "And you are different," he replied. "Few women would fall into a bath and face the aftermath with courage. You endure." The words struck her in a way she did not expect. She felt a heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment this time, but from the recognition that he saw her. Truly saw her, beyond appearances, beyond social expectations, beyond the town's whispers. For the first time since the bathhouse incident, Evelyn allowed herself to relax completely. She understood, in a quiet, unspoken way, that this man, scarred, stoic, and steadfast, was more than a protector. He was someone she could trust. Someone whose presence made the world feel steadier, safer, more vivid. And as she watched him work, muscles moving gracefully, scars illuminated by firelight, she felt a stirring of something deeper, something that promised to grow, quietly but irresistibly, between them. For the first time, she wondered if this accidental encounter, this fall into a bath, had been fate after all. The afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the jagged silhouette of the mountains when the first dark clouds rolled across the valley. A chill wind swept through the camp, rustling the furs and tent flaps with an urgent insistence. Lone Hawk noticed the shift immediately, his eyes narrowing as he studied the horizon. Evelyn, absorbed in watching the children chase one another through the tall grass, did not sense the storm until the first cold droplets splashed her shoulders. Within moments, the sky darkened entirely, and thunder rumbled through the mountains like distant cannon fire. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the camp in stark white flashes. "Storm," Lone Hawk said simply, his voice calm as though he had expected it. Evelyn shivered, realizing her wet dress and soaked blanket left her uncomfortably exposed to the elements. She looked around for shelter, only to find the small canvas tents barely sturdy enough to withstand a windstorm of this force. The children and their mothers scurried to cover, and scouts began securing supplies. But the chaos of nature left Evelyn feeling fragile and small. Before she could protest or make a move, Lone Hawk had reached for her arm. His grip was firm but not harsh, and the warmth of his hands burned through the damp fabric of her sleeves. "Come," he said, voice low. "The lodge." She obeyed instinctively, letting him guide her through the whipping wind. The rain fell in sheets now, cold and relentless, drumming on the roof of the lodge and turning the surrounding ground into slick mud. Evelyn slipped once, and he caught her without hesitation, holding her close enough that she felt the heat of his body through the wet layers. Inside the lodge, the fire had been rekindled, and the warmth was almost unbearable after the storm's cold bite. Lone Hawk moved to secure the entrance, closing the flaps and setting stones to keep the wind from pushing through. Evelyn's body still trembled, though now from relief rather than fear, and she realized her wet clothing clung to her in ways that made her self-conscious. "You're cold," Lone Hawk said simply, taking off the damp blanket that had been wrapped around her. He replaced it with a dry buffalo hide, draping it over her shoulders and adjusting it around her body, so she could sit comfortably near the fire. Evelyn's fingers brushed his as she accepted the warmth. A jolt of electricity ran through her, sudden and shocking, as if the storm outside had mirrored the storm rising within her. "You're safe," he said quietly, his dark eyes watching her closely. "The storm will not harm you here. I know," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "But the wind, the rain, it's so fierce." He stepped closer, the heat radiating from him, enveloping her in a cocoon of safety. His hand brushed against hers again as he adjusted the buffalo hide. This time, neither pulled away. The contact lingered, small but deliberate, and Evelyn felt a strange, dizzying mixture of comfort and longing. "Do not fear," he said, his voice lower now, warmer, almost intimate. "Not while I am here." She lifted her gaze to his, catching the faintest hint of a smile in the flickering firelight. Her breath caught. There was no judgment in his expression, no expectation, only steady presence. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The storm had brought them together not just in space, but in trust, in vulnerability. Evelyn shifted slightly closer, instinctively seeking warmth, and he did not recoil. Their hands touched again, longer this time, deliberate yet unspoken. Thunder rolled once more, shaking the lodge, and in the shadows and firelight, the distance between them seemed to collapse, for the first time. Evelyn felt that spark, not just admiration, not just gratitude, but a quiet, undeniable desire that neither the storm nor the world outside could deny. And Lone Hawk, ever steady, ever silent, held her hand a fraction longer than necessary, as if acknowledging that the accident in the bathhouse had led them to this moment strangers no longer, but something far closer. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a different kind of heat had taken hold. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Drops still fell from the roof, and the last rumble of thunder lingered faintly in the mountains. But inside the lodge, a different quiet had settled. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, illuminating the contours of Lone Hawk's face, and for the first time, Evelyn felt she could breathe fully without the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her. She sat near the fire, the buffalo hide still draped around her shoulders, her fingers absently brushing the edge of the fabric. Lone Hawk was near her, leaning against the wall, arms crossed loosely, his gaze distant but somehow aware of her every movement. The closeness, the warmth, the quiet, all of it was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the chaos she had known outside the lodge walls. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. I'm tired." Lone Hawk's dark eyes met hers immediately. "Of the storm?" he asked. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Of everything. Of being judged. Of being expected to behave a certain way, to hide parts of myself I cannot hide. I thought I could leave the city behind, but the whispers followed me here. The fear followed me here." He listened without interrupting, his presence solid, grounding. When she paused, the weight of her confession hanging in the air, he spoke, low and steady. "You fear what others think, but that does not define you. Only you can do that." Evelyn's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, and yet the years of imposed expectations, of stifled desires, made it difficult. "It feels impossible sometimes," she admitted, "to be seen as myself and not as a scandal, a mistake, a misstep." Lone Hawk leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes softening with an emotion she could not name. "I have not touched a woman in years," he said quietly. "Not because I do not want to, but because I will not give half a heart. I will not take a life in which I am unwilling to give everything." Her breath caught at the weight of his words. There was honesty in them, but also a kind of vulnerability that few men allowed themselves. And in the flickering firelight, she saw the raw humanity beneath the warrior's stoic exterior. She started, then faltered. "I have never felt, understood like this before. Like someone sees me, not the expectations, not the gossip, not the rules." "You are seen," he said simply. "Truly seen. And you may choose to trust that, or not." The words struck her profoundly. Here, in the shadow of the storm, wrapped in warmth and the steady presence of a man who had caught her when she fell, Evelyn felt a pull she could no longer deny. She inched closer, her shoulder brushing his, the contact light but electric. He did not move away. He did not speak, only let the silence fill the space between them, a silence heavy with possibility. She realized that this closeness, this quiet, This acknowledgement of each other was the first time in her life she had felt safe enough to surrender her fears. Even briefly, Evelyn's voice broke again, barely a whisper. I want to trust you. I think I already do. Lone Hawk's gaze softened, dark eyes reflecting the firelight and the storm's memory outside. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, warm and grounding, a silent promise passing between them without a word. The lodge, the fire, the wet earth beyond, they all faded into the background. There was only this moment, only this connection, only the unspoken truth that both had been searching for, neither knowing they would find it in each other, and in that quiet darkness. Evelyn realized that what had begun as an accident, a fall into a bath, was becoming something far more profound. The start of a bond that neither circumstance nor fear could break. The sun had risen pale and weak over the valley when the first signs of the town arrived. Dust swirled in the early morning light as a small group of riders approached Lone Hawk's camp, their faces hard with authority and expectation. Among them was the sheriff, looking every bit as officious as Evelyn remembered, accompanied by a handful of townsfolk whose whispers had haunted her since the bathhouse incident. Evelyn's stomach tightened as the riders drew nearer. She had hoped the distance from town would shield her from the harsh scrutiny, but now it seemed the past had followed her here, relentless and unyielding. Her heart raced not from fear of the storm this time, but from the confrontation she knew was inevitable. "They have come for me," she murmured, her hand brushing against Lone Hawk's arm. The warmth of his presence had become a lifeline, a steady anchor amidst the rising tension. He nodded, dark eyes scanning the approaching figures. "Let them come," he said calmly. "No harm will reach you while I stand here." The sheriff dismounted first, his boots crunching on the hard earth. "Miss Carter," he said, voice carrying authority tinged with impatience, "you are required to return to town immediately. Your guardians, your family, if you have any, expect you. The townspeople are concerned for your reputation and your safety." Evelyn's cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with a rising defiance she had never known she could feel. She glanced at Lone Hawk, whose gaze was steady and unwavering, and felt a surge of courage bloom in her chest. "I am not going back," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. The words hung in the crisp morning air, and a hush fell over the approaching crowd. "You?" "What?" the sheriff asked, incredulous. "You cannot refuse the town's authority." "I can," she replied, lifting her chin. "And I will. I choose to remain here. I choose to remain with him." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, disbelief and scandal mixing in equal measure. Evelyn felt the weight of their judgment pressing down, but she did not falter. She could feel the warmth of Lone Hawk's hand at her side, the quiet strength of his presence giving her the courage to stand for herself. Lone Hawk stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her, his posture calm but commanding. "She is under my protection," he said, his voice carrying the same authority that had silenced the bathhouse crowd weeks before. "She chooses to remain here." "That is her right." The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered under their breath, but none dared to challenge the warrior's declaration. The sheriff, brow furrowed and jaw tight, finally gave a reluctant nod, realizing that force would achieve nothing against a man whose authority was absolute in his own land. Evelyn's heart pounded with a mixture of exhilaration and relief. For the first time, she felt truly free of the expectations, whispers, and judgments that had dominated her life. She was no longer defined by the town's narrow view of propriety or by the accident that had caused so much scandal. She had made her choice, and it was a choice that affirmed her autonomy, her courage, and her growing connection to Lone Hawk. As the riders began to retreat, murmuring and shaking their heads, Evelyn turned fully to Lone Hawk. The firelight, or Perhaps the first golden rays of the morning sun caught in his eyes, and she realized that everything had shifted. The accident in the bathhouse, the storm, the whispers, and the judgment had all led to this moment, a choice made freely, boldly, and irrevocably. She reached for his arm, her fingers brushing against his, and said softly, almost shyly, "Then I stay. With you." His expression softened, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small, rare smile. "Then it is so," he said quietly. "You are where you belong." Evelyn's chest swelled with a mix of pride, relief, and a tender joy she had never experienced before. The world outside, the town, the judgment, the fear was irrelevant. Here, with Lone Hawk, she had found safety, respect, and the first glimmers of a bond that promised something deeper than she had ever dared imagine. For the first time since falling into his bath, she felt entirely, unquestionably at home. The camp had returned to its quiet rhythm after the confrontation with the townsfolk. Smoke curled lazily from the small fires, children's laughter floated in the distance, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Evelyn sat near the largest fire, Lone Hawk beside her, their hands intertwined for the first time without hesitation. The morning's events, the bathhouse accident, the town's judgment, the storm, and her bold declaration to remain had left her both exhilarated and contemplative. She cast her gaze at Lone Hawk, taking in the lines of his face, the strength in his shoulders, the quiet authority in his posture. And she thought back to that first moment when she had fallen into his bath. What had begun as an awkward accident had grown into something neither of them could have predicted: trust, respect, and a connection deeper than either had experienced before. "I keep thinking about the bath," she said softly, the words almost hesitant, "about how it all started there. She paused, unsure how to put into words the strange gratitude she felt. "I fell into your bath, and yet it feels like I fell into something far greater than myself." Lone Hawk's gaze met hers, dark eyes steady and warm. "The spirits sometimes move in ways we do not understand," he said quietly. "Some accidents are not accidents at all. Perhaps they guided you to me." Evelyn smiled, a soft, shy curve of her lips. "Then perhaps the spirits were wise," she replied, feeling the weight of every step that had led her here, her fall, his calm hands, the judgment of strangers, the storm that had forced them together. Each moment had shaped her, each moment had tested her, and each moment had drawn her closer to him. He nodded slowly. "And I am glad of it," he said. "You came into my life by accident, but I will keep you by choice." The simplicity of the words struck her. There was no grand declaration, no flourish of romance meant to impress. It was honest, deliberate, unshakable, a promise rooted in respect and understanding. Evelyn felt her chest swell with emotion she had never expected to feel, the kind of contentment and security that only comes when one knows they are seen, truly seen, and valued. "By choice," she repeated softly, savoring the meaning. She leaned slightly closer, letting the warmth of his presence envelop her. His hand, still holding hers, was firm but gentle, grounding yet reassuring. It was a touch that spoke volumes of protection, of patience, of something deeper that neither words nor the past could fully capture. The camp around them faded into a soft blur, the firelight dancing across their faces. Outside, the valley stretched endlessly, untouched and wild, a reminder of the freedom they now shared. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something profound. The bathhouse accident, the town's judgment, the storm, the fear, and even the tear, and even the vulnerability she had felt, all of it had led to this singular truth. The bath had been the beginning, but it had been the bridge, not the destination. The accident had allowed them to meet, yes, but it had been choice, trust, and courage that carried them forward. And now, in the quiet of the lodge, surrounded by the remnants of the storm and the warmth of firelight, Evelyn and Lone Hawk had crossed that bridge together. He leaned closer, his forehead brushing hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. "You are where you belong," he whispered, a quiet affirmation that resonated deep within her. Evelyn smiled, feeling the last remnants of doubt and fear melt away. "Yes," she whispered back, "I belong here, with you." The world outside, the town, the whispers, the expectations no longer mattered. There was only this moment, only this choice, only the bond that had formed from an accident, nurtured through trust and courage, and solidified by a connection that neither could deny. And as firelight danced in their eyes, Evelyn realized with a warmth she could feel to her core that she had found something far more powerful than safety or protection. She had found love, chosen and freely given, born from a fall that had led her to the man who would hold her body, heart, and soul forever. The spirits had been wise indeed.